Hello again from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. On September the 30th, 1938, was concluded the so-called Munich Agreement. It was one of the biggest diplomatic deceptions orchestrated by the German Nazi dictator or Führer, Mr. Adolf Hitler. Because it claimed that after Britain and France, who should have helped Czechoslovakia, an Eastern Central European country, that was the only remaining democracy in Eastern Europe. So that Germany would not invade it or take away any parts of its territory, including the heavily ethnic German border areas, western border areas known as the Sudetenland. So, in the name of appeasement, which meant making concessions to Germany so as to avoid the Second World War, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and his French colleague Prime Minister Édouard Daladier signed this agreement, which claimed that the Sudetenland would be Hitler's last territorial demand in Europe. We of course know, those of us who have bothered to read and or watch historical documentaries about that period of history, how long the agreement remained in force. For 5.5 months. From September the 30th, 1938 until March the 15th, 1939, when Germany occupied most of the remaining parts of Czechoslovakia. It, to some extent, pleased Hungary's dictatorial government by allowing Hungary to annex Carpatho-Ruthenia in eastern Czechoslovakia, and to some extent this was also meant to decrease Soviet fears of a German invasion. So, especially Chamberlain seems to have been just about completely duped, because on his return to Britain, he waived that declaration according to which should there be any major foreign policy problems in the future, Britain and Germany, or especially foreign policy problems involving Europe, Britain and Germany would consult each other. He waived it and said, "I believe it is peace for our time." There were many, however, in Britain and elsewhere who disagreed, or at least were skeptical. Prime Minister Chamberlain's fellow conservative, Winston Churchill, who was then a backbencher member of the British House of Commons, so not a cabinet minister, predicted that this agreement would not last long and that Germany would betray those who believed in appeasement, and he was right. Essentially, Britain and France were only able to buy 11 months more before the Second World War officially broke out in Europe on September the 1st, 1939. And after Czechoslovakia, most of the remainder of Czechoslovakia was occupied by Germany, although Slovakia was then given a superficial independence to please the nationalist and separatist Slovaks. Obviously, Prime Minister Chamberlain felt deeply hurt and betrayed. And therefore, he then reluctantly changed his foreign policy line, abandoning appeasement and extending on March the 31st, 1939, territorial guarantees and independence guarantees to Poland. alongside, and also Prime Minister Daladier did the same. And on April the 27th, 1939, those two major Western European democracies promised to guarantee the territorial integrity and independence of Romania and Greece. By that time, Germany's Fall Weiss, or Plan White or Case White, was in full swing already in terms of its preparations. So Czechoslovakia, which had been humiliated by the non-invitation of any of its political or diplomatic representatives, neither the Czechoslovak president, Mr. Edvard Beneš, who had for a long time before becoming president served as the country's foreign minister, nor any representative of the Czechoslovak government, nor even any ambassador or diplomat of Czechoslovakia. So those Czechoslovaks who felt betrayed by the agreement said that it represented, that it was about them but without them. So Czechoslovakia then in early October 1938 surrendered mostly peacefully the Sudetenland to Germany. There were some minor border battles, and possibly also when most of the remainder of Czechoslovakia was occupied in March 1939, but no notable battles. While there had been tensions between the Czechs and Germans in the Sudetenland, for example, because despite the fact that the Germans composed over 20% of Czechoslovakia's population, and in many regions of the Sudetenland, a majority of the population, they were not given even local linguistic autonomy. The Czech language remained as the only official language even in Sudetenland. Besides, according to a Wikipedia article, they had to surrender, for example, their theaters for 1 hour per week to the local Czechs. And since the Sudetenland was so heavily industrialized, it was more heavily hit by the Great Depression of the early 1930s than the rest of Czechoslovakia, which was less industrialized, and especially Slovakia was still largely agrarian. So there had been tensions, however, there was no systematic oppression of the German minority. They were simply denied linguistic and cultural autonomy, like in their official forms. While by contrast, the small Estonia in the Baltic region of Northern Europe had allowed all of its ethnic minorities that composed at least 3,000 people to establish their official cultural autonomy, and the Baltic German and Jewish minorities, if I remember correctly, or the Baltic German and Russian minorities had officially established that cultural autonomy. The first Czechoslovak Republic from 1918 to 1938 or 39, depending on the interpretation, was based on the idea that the Czechs and Slovaks, who are closely related both ethnically, culturally, and linguistically, were actually one and same ethnic group, only different tribes of it. And because of that, such Czechoslovak political leaders as Presidents Tomáš Masaryk and Edvard Beneš then promoted this idea of a single Czechoslovak nationality. Accordingly, only the Czech language was the official one in Czechoslovakia. Even the Slovak language did not have an official status. Apparently, it was considered just a dialect of the Czech language. And while, especially in their standard forms, their so-called book language forms, the two languages are close enough to be mutually intelligible or understandable by their native speakers, their non-standard dialects do differ more commonly. Czechoslovakia also included a sizable Hungarian minority in its southeastern part, and that minority still exists in southern Slovakia of today. But even the Hungarians did not receive any kind of linguistic or cultural autonomy or self-government. So Hitler was still able to use that pretense that he simply wanted to uphold the national right of self-government, or self-determination, sorry. And he wanted to gather another discriminated against a German ethnic group into the so-called Greater Germany. He had already annexed his native land Austria in March 1938 bloodlessly. And while in that case, probably a majority of the Austrians who cared about such issues would have agreed to a peaceful annexation or Anschluss of Austria by Germany, actually already at the end of or just after the First World War in 1918-1919, there had been many German Austrians who had favored Anschluss. Then in Czechoslovakia, of course, the situation was different because Czechoslovakia was by its majority a Slavic country, not a Germanic one. And while probably many, if not most, Sudeten Germans either wanted to or did not oppose being annexed by Germany, we have to remember that there were many Czechs alongside them living in those border regions. And most of those Czechs certainly did not want to be annexed by Germany. So it was a big betrayal, a big diplomatic defeat for both Britain and France, and generally speaking for those who felt that by appeasing Hitler he would stop his territorial grabs. He didn't. And after forcibly annexing, although with little open military opposition, but after bullying the aged and sickly Czechoslovak president, Mr. Emil Hácha, into surrendering the remainder of Czechoslovakia to Germany, with the exception of Carpatho-Ruthenia, he didn't even mind the fact that President Hácha, because of the shock at Hitler's murderous threats against the rump Czechoslovakia, had suffered a heart attack and had to be revived by injections administered by Hitler's personal medical doctor. And that happened on the night of March the 14th to 15th, 1939. Only about 1 week later, Germany forced, under the threat of invasion, the small country of Lithuania in the Baltic region of Northern Europe or Northeastern Europe to surrender its Memel or Klaipeda region to Germany. And then only a couple of weeks later, Italy invaded the tiny country of Albania across the Adriatic Sea and quickly and easily annexed it. So these demands already showed, and these actions showed, that both Germany and Italy wanted to annex other countries, wanted to grab portions of the pie of other countries that supposedly belonged to them. Germany also then pressed Poland to return, to agree to let the free city of Danzig, or Gdansk as it's now called, to be annexed by Germany, once again using that national self-determination excuse, because a great majority of that free city's inhabitants were ethnic Germans. And also the fact that most of their politically active voters had in the recent election supported the Nazis. Poland, however, refused to allow this, because that would basically have made a great majority of Poland's foreign trade dependent on the doubtful Nazi German benevolence. Poland also refused to allow Germans to build a highway and a railway across the Polish corridor, that narrow territory of land that gave Poland access to the Baltic Sea's southern coast. And that highway and railway would also have belonged to Germany, because that would basically have allowed the Germans to quickly cut off communication between the narrow Polish coast and the rest of Poland, and of course trade and so forth. Germany then, in early April 1939, revoked its non-aggression or non-invasion treaty with Poland, and started in earnest to prepare for the invasion of Poland, which was then known as the September Campaign. Despite their military guarantees to help Poland in case Germany invaded it, Britain and France did little. France did stage a token attack that carried its troops some or several kilometers into Western Germany. However, it did not even try to break through the so-called Siegfried Line of fortifications. And thus Poland had to fight alone, and was only able to hold out for some 5 weeks against the superior, numerically and technologically superior German and Soviet forces. Slovakia also did send an army contingent, but it had only a minor role in the occupation or reoccupation and repartition of Poland.